All right. Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to all of you from GeoHazards International. We're excited to have you with us today for this webinar. We're going to go ahead and get started. Today, we'll be talking about advancing scenario practice to motivate mitigation. We'll be sharing some key findings on our research on past scenarios of geologic hazard events. So first, just a little bit of navigation. So what we'll be doing today, some introductions, then we'll go into our main presentation. And then after that, we'll have some Q&A. And you should have on your Zoom bar a couple of buttons. One of them is a Q&A button. And we'd like to ask if you have questions, please go ahead and start dropping those in that Q&A portal as we're going along, and we'll take some of those live in the Q&A session, and some of those we'll be answering. We can answer some of those in the Q&A itself as we go along. There's also a chat that we can use, but if you can put the questions in the Q&A, that'll help us out with making sure we don't lose track of the question. In the Q&A, there will be a link that's going to be shared. Part of what we're going to be doing is developing some practice advancements for how we can improve scenarios, and we'd love to have your participation in that. So if you're interested, there'll be a link in the chat that you can click to fill out a simple Google form. So, and I think that's going to be coming along soon, that link. So, I'd like to first start by saying a few words about GeoHazards International. I'm Janice Rogers, by the way. I am the Chief Operating Officer of GeoHazards International and am the team lead for this project that we'll be sharing with you today. And GeoHazards International is a nonprofit organization. We are headquartered in California with a presence in 5 countries in South Asia and in the Caribbean. And our mission is really to save lives by empowering at-risk communities worldwide to build resilience ahead of disasters and climate impacts. And we've been around since 1991. And one of the things, and pretty much since that time, we have been working on scenarios because they're just a powerful process tool for the way we like to work. And this slide shows a little bit about that. We like to take action, of course, before disasters. We feel like that's really where we can intervene and have the most impact. We want to connect leaders with expertise. We want to advance local capabilities, considering, of course, the social context. We want to communicate with people, inspire them that they're on the right track, they're building resilience in their communities, and we want to cultivate trust. So scenarios have really been part of GHI's DNA since our first scenario work in Quito, Ecuador, several decades ago now. And we are thrilled to be talking about how we might be advancing practice and working in the future. So based on what we're learning and what we'll share with you today. So I have the honor of being part of a wonderful group of colleagues that are working on this effort, and we're going to be able to hear from a few of them today. And I'd like them to come on camera and introduce themselves. So Dr. Nania Campbell from the Bill Anderson Fund.
Good morning. My name is Nania Campbell. I am the Deputy Director at the Bill Anderson Fund, which is a nonprofit organization focused on increasing minority participation in hazards and disaster-related fields. I am also a research associate at the Natural Hazards Center and a sociologist. So my background with scenarios is with evaluation and also developing communication products. And I look forward to the discussion today. Thank you.
Thanks, Nania. And Dr. Sue-Ann Sarpy, the principal and founder of Sarpy and Associates.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sue-Ann Sarpy. I am an industrial organizational psychologist, working primarily with evaluating scenarios, and my degree is based in psychology and business. So what I'm going to be presenting today will be actually one of the business principles, and we'll be talking about that later. And I've done a great deal of work with emergency preparedness and community resilience.
All right, thanks very much, Sue-Ann. And as mentioned, I'm Janice Rogers. My background is in structural and earthquake engineering. So we have a range of disciplines in this project. Now I'd like to say a couple of things about the project itself. So this is an applied research project. It's supported by the U.S. Agency for International Development. We also had a component of the work that was supported by the U.S. Geological Survey. So we first wanted to take a look at, well, what have scenarios been able to achieve, right? Have they been effective? Have people been able to use them? Have they found them to be a tool that was practical and helpful in terms of motivating mitigation? And we're looking specifically at mitigation. And then once we see what we've learned from the use of scenarios for geologic hazard events in the past, how can we then develop some practice advancements to make scenarios even better, especially in countries where USAID works? And then in a follow-on project, we'll look at implementing what we've learned and come up with. And the motivation for this was really, we've worked on scenarios at GHI for a long time. I've personally worked on at least 5, and we have some observations, but there weren't any specific systematic studies to understand, well, how effective have scenarios actually been at motivating mitigation? People say, okay, let's we want mitigation to happen as a result of all this effort we're putting forth, but did that actually take place? And then, of course, what features would make scenarios more effective or less effective? We can then carry forward into future scenarios. We also noted that we needed some practice advancements because there's been a lot going on in topics that are adjacent to scenarios, everything from risk communication to some more computational approaches for looking at multiple scenarios or multiple hazards. And we want to try to bring that into scenario practice because we are living in a very multi-hazard world, and now with climate impacts becoming more and more prevalent, we want to be able to look at those things. Now, this project's only looking at geologic hazards, but going to the future, we want to be able to meet the needs of the communities that we serve that are really in that multi-hazard context and wanting to look at everything in a holistic way. And we also want to be able to bring in something that's not done too often for geologic hazard scenarios, and that's the rich body of knowledge from, say, business strategic planning, using scenarios to look at different alternate futures and how to support decision-making in the context of uncertainty, which we absolutely have with geologic hazard events. So this is the project team. I don't have time to introduce everyone, but we have a wonderful team spanning disciplines and geographies who have been working on this project and now for over 1.5 years. The scope of the study is really tightly focused on mitigation. And now scenarios are used very commonly in emergency preparedness exercises and more generally, but we wanted to look specifically at the aspects of mitigation, pre-disaster mitigation, and to look at that aspect of it. Geologic hazards we're looking at in this project are earthquakes, volcanoes, and landslides. Volcanoes, of course, are much more complex than earthquakes in terms of how you might need to understand them and work with them in terms of public awareness and what might happen. There's a lot of complexity. And so this has been very interesting to take a look at. And we are, to sort of keep things manageable, we only are looking at 4 sites where we did interviews, but we're looking at literature globally. And I want to also define scenarios here at the beginning. People use that term in a lot of different ways, but the types of scenarios that we're looking at have 3 essential components. First, we've got to have a science-based assessment of a selected hazard event. Then we also need to talk about, well, what happens? The damage that can be to infrastructure, maybe to buildings, maybe to land, and then the consequences to people and also to society. If we just had one of those pieces, we'd call that a scenario component study, and there are thousands and thousands of those. So we're really focusing in on the more, the scenarios that have these 3 components. Our research questions, well, how are scenarios being used and to what extent? What features did people find important? Secondly, Third, what actually happened, what policies or practices were developed, adopted, or changed, and what was the role of scenarios in that whole process? And then what was the role of hazard information specifically, and the idea about quote, scientific quality for scenarios to be considered credible and effective. Our methods, literature and document review. And then we did 158 interviews that Nania is going to be talking about in a bit more detail across Ecuador, Nepal, New Zealand. Those were funded by the USAID part of the project, and then a specific study in California funded by the USGS focused around earthquakes. We then, Nania and Sue-Ann and their team analyzed the transcripts, logged, and then we logged the mitigation impacts to which scenarios contributed, and then went back and looked at documents to see what we could triangulate. We've also done, looking to the future, some exploratory modeling of multi-hazard approaches, and that work is being done primarily at Stanford University. And then we're doing some participatory workshops with more to come as we develop practice advances. So our interview sites, a little bit about how we selected those. We wanted to be able to look at all three of our hazards. And we also, because we're looking at, well, what's happened in terms of mitigation, we also needed a significant body of scenario work and to look at that. And so that led us to places like Nepal, which has several decades of scenarios and their use, and a number of scenarios, as well as Ecuador. Then New Zealand has scenarios are a little bit more recent, but a lot of work on volcanoes, for example. And so we wanted to look at that. And then California has a very, very significant body of both scenarios and mitigation that we could really work with. And we were able to take a look at California. We did not look at the rest of the United States. Those numbers are just for comparison. California has a very large share of the US scenario work, partly because we have a lot of earthquakes. So who did we interview very quickly? The organizations that are very involved in scenario development and use varied a little bit by site. For example, in California, there's a lot of local government and infrastructure agencies. In Nepal, the international development sector is very involved in using scenarios. In New Zealand, government, especially at national level and regional level, very involved, as well as people in academia, and especially in Ecuador, the academic institutions were very involved in using scenarios, and so that was who we could interview. Our primary technical disciplines, a lot of earth scientists and emergency managers in Ecuador and New Zealand, and a few more engineers in California. Again, you're seeing that participation of the infrastructure agencies, particularly, which have a lot of engineers, but a pretty good disciplinary mix of a lot of different people who are involved with geologic hazards and resilience problems, everything from land use planning to communications. And as far as developers versus users, we tried to interview a majority of users, and were able to do that at all of our sites except for Ecuador, where we were able to get developers. We were doing this during a pandemic, which was a challenge. So now I would like to turn it over to Nania and Sue-Ann to talk about what we found during the interviews.
Great, thank you. And let me just get my screen shared. Okay, thanks again, Janice, for setting us up. I will be starting off our discussion here talking about the interview findings specifically from this project. To give you a quick overview of where we're headed, I'll be going through the qualitative findings from the interviews by research questions, so to keep them kind of organized thematically. I will be discussing some of the comparisons and what we found, the themes that emerged in the data across the 4 different locations. And then I'm going to hand it over to Sue-Ann, who's going to discuss some of the quantitative data that were generated by the interviews. So as a quick refresher about our research questions, that our first research question really focuses in on decision makers and end users, and specifically on how they've thought about and used scenarios to formulate or guide decisions or practices for addressing earthquake risks. So it asks how and to what extent have decision makers in various categories, and that this is most relevant to our discussion today, utilize scenarios in making or formulating policies to address earthquake risk. And if they haven't used them, what were the reasons? But at the core of this question is our need to understand how the user base engages with scenarios, how they come to rely on them or not, and for what applications they're being used. So to start drilling into this question, we sought to obtain some foundational insights about how decision makers and users were using scenarios and other informational resources to kind of guide their decisions and practices. So to get at this, we asked what kind of informational resources the interviewees and their organizations typically use to develop practices and or policies related to risks from geologic hazards. And that yielded some useful insights by kind of shedding light on the sources that they were drawing on, again, both from scenarios and elsewhere, to inform policies and practices and policy development. So we'll see these types of resources referenced throughout our analyses in response to different questions, which helps to kind of validate the patterns that we're seeing in the data. So we'll see these kind of echoing throughout some of the other questions as well. But the responses to this specific question on informational resources pointed to a variety of resources across sites, including population level impacts and loss estimates. We saw references to that coming out really strongly as themes across all 4 sites, on maps and data visualizations, scientific information products and summaries. So again, that can be products from the scenarios themselves or additional science information products. And then to a lesser extent, we didn't see this across all sites, but we did see a fair amount of discussion about subject matter experts and translation. So for that, we're referencing those folks who are able to take that technical expertise, technical information that's generated by the scenarios, and then develop key takeaways of that for people in decision-making roles. So a heavy reliance on those people in those translator roles. It's also worth noting that we did see some variation in these responses, particularly in the context of Ecuador. We had a number of respondents referencing barriers to accessing data that was needed for decision-making or for those potential end users. And among those specific challenges that were referenced in Ecuador were kind of data restrictions and lack of information, either at the resolution or level of insight that was needed, as well as some resource constraints related to ongoing work. And so in those cases, one of the findings that was interesting was that in the absence of this kind of information that was really needed, we saw participants talking about utilizing the resources and technology that were available to them to kind of augment imperfect information and still be able to make evidence-based decisions, even if it wasn't with the highest resolution data or the specific kinds of information that they wanted for those applications. But that was still necessary to be able to understand and communicate about risks. The second research question, again, kind of drills down a little bit further into our investigation of how scenarios specifically were being used for decision-making. And so as a refresher, that question reads, for those who have used scenarios or scenario component studies, which again is the majority of our sample across all the sites, what specific features did they find most important, compelling, and useful? Were there particular results or processes to develop the scenario or communicating results that were particularly useful and why? And it also asks about how those features specifically were utilized in subsequent work. So we included in the interviews a range of questions that spoke to those issues, and the first of which kind of includes feedback about the usefulness of scenarios, which I'll go into next. The responses from decision makers about scenario utility, whether that information was used and whether it was useful, fell into kind of 3 overarching categories or themes, and those included strengths, the most useful components of the scenario, and then areas where the scenarios were maybe missing the mark a little bit or could be improved to make them more useful to the end users. In terms of strengths, one of the primary things that we saw, themes that we saw emerging across all of the locations was about information about potential impacts. And so we see that that's carrying forward for the kinds of informational resources that were mentioned in the last slides. Overwhelmingly, we saw that information about potential impacts being referenced across interview locations. And that's the information that's most sought out by decision makers. And that makes sense, right? Thinking about most decision makers needing an understanding of what's going to happen, where and how people and assets in that area would be affected. And the following quote kind of illustrates how that information was being used. This is a decision maker in California who said, the scenario gives us a good reference point for what we need to worry about for a large regional event that nobody had really thought so well about before. So helping them kind of envision what would happen, giving a point of reference for being able to make decisions in response to something more concrete, and illuminating different ways that the community could be impacted that they hadn't necessarily considered previously. Other strengths that were referenced included the scenario's educational and informational aspects. And here we see that this is because they enabled users to kind of break down technical information or engage in storytelling and visualizations. Broadly, just to give that big picture view of community and community impacts and the geographical distribution of those. And those strengths are also reflected in what participants identified as specifically the most useful components of scenarios. Sometimes this was the actual content of the scenario, and sometimes it was the process through which it was developed. But here we see a theme emerging under the most useful components as the facilitation of stakeholder engagement. So in some cases that was there were various types of stakeholders that were discussed, from utilities operators to residents, but usually using the scenario to kind of start those conversations. There was also another theme on just, again, the depiction of potential losses and damage. Again, the need to know, scenarios answering that need to know kind of what's going to happen and what's at stake. And then as the use of scenarios as a source document or a basis for action. Again, having that point of reference that kind of enables action, subsequent action based on the results of the scenario. There were some dimensions of scenarios that participants felt could be improved. And the most consistent overarching theme under that category was the simplification for non-experts. So here we saw that across most of the location, there was a need for the scenarios to be broken down for different kinds of applications to make them more accessible to non-expert and non-technical audiences. So whether that was for having different information presented in different ways, for tailoring for different audiences, or other kinds of modifications, but broadly the notion here was the need to make it easier to understand and share the information that the scenarios were generating. This primary theme was observed across most of the sites, and then there were also suggestions for improvement that varied more by location. So in California, for example, we saw a need for improvement being referenced commonly as the need to emphasize the benefits of mitigation. In Nepal, we saw suggestions around the need for validating the scenarios. In New Zealand, there was a request for a stronger cultural sensitivity or grounding as a suggestion for improvement. But again, those broke down more across the sites. And so what I'm presenting here is the most common responses that we saw across multiple research sites. So in addition to asking about the usefulness of scenarios, this question also sought to understand whether there were particular results or processes to develop the scenario or communicate the results that were especially useful. And so in addition to talking to users, the interview teams also interviewed, as Janice mentioned, the developers about the scenario development process specifically and the key features that they had found most useful. And across the sites, three overarching themes emerged. One of those was scientific collaboration. We saw this in all of the countries mentioned as a core component of the scenario development process, and that looked differently in different locations. For example, in California and New Zealand, we saw a heavy emphasis on scientific collaboration. And also in California, as well as in Nepal and Ecuador, we saw more emphasis on co-production. So this idea that we're co-producing the scenarios with other types of expertise outside of necessarily the scientific and technical teams developing the scenario. So it kind of looked different, but overall there was this emphasis on collaboration. We did see interesting that this theme did emerge across all of the sites, but there was a little bit lesser extent in certain locations and some variation in how it was being discussed. So comparatively fewer interviewees, for example, in Ecuador explicitly referenced collaboration, and same in New Zealand, or in Nepal rather. But it did still feature throughout all of these locations. It was just where the overarching theme was strongest, was the variation that we saw. There was also some emphasis on outreach and engagement. So again, we saw this theme emerge across all of the sites to a slightly lesser extent in Nepal, but still present. Interestingly, the third theme that emerged was primarily in Ecuador and Nepal, and that was in participants talking about the technical approach of scenario development as a core component. So really talking about the layering of scientific analyses, the detailing of methodologies that were used or software that was involved, the specific components that were produced. So more emphasis in those two locations on that particular theme. But overall, we did see these commonalities emerging across all of the sites. So in summary, the things that were most important about the scenario development process from the perspective of the developers was those processes that facilitated collaboration, both internally and externally, and then those that gave the scenarios a firm scientific grounding. Those were the things that were viewed as most useful. Research question 2 also sought to understand whether particular approaches to communicating scenario results were especially useful and why. So in analyzing the responses from users and developers, we found that there were a lot of commonalities in how results were being shared, but there was also some variation in how particular methods were utilized in the different environments, particularly in terms of socializing the results with various types of stakeholders. Overwhelmingly, the most common format that was used to communicate scenario results was technical publications and reports. That makes sense. Those are the common communication formats within the scientific community. But although that was the most commonly referenced product or output from scenarios, the reach of those kinds of products was often recognized, volunteered by the interviewees, that that's not necessarily the best way to reach decision makers or other kinds of stakeholders. So we also saw a frequent use of presentations, primarily in California, New Zealand, and Ecuador. These were referenced. And those were a key mechanism for sharing findings with decision makers and other stakeholders. Also, meetings and events discussed across all 4 sites. There was a significant emphasis on meetings and events, but again, there was variation in what those looked like in different locations. So for example, in California and New Zealand, there was an emphasis on kind of large events and conference style meetings to develop scenarios and to disseminate the findings. In New Zealand and Ecuador, there was a fair amount of discussion about meetings between scenario developers and end users to kind of iterate the development, ground truth assumptions, and then also to disseminate findings. We saw other kinds of products discussed as well commonly. Multimedia products was another prominent theme in the data, and that included videos, animations, story maps, kind of to relay the findings in easily digestible ways for non-technical audiences, data visualizations and tools being used. And so for that, we're thinking people were referencing maps and 3D models, event trees, kind of other visualizations that relayed complex concepts visually and in geographic context. And again, that was something we saw across most of the research sites as a prominent theme. There was a fair amount of discussion of websites, but not as a key tactic. It was interesting that they were referenced in many locations, but didn't appear to be utilized as heavily, did not receive as much discussion. And then press releases and media engagements. And across all sites, there was some reference to scenario developers disseminating summaries and statements to the media to kind of generate coverage and facilitate engagement with the broader public. There were other themes that emerged as well, other kinds of products that were developed that weren't necessarily used as consistently across all sites. So there was social media campaigns that were referenced in a few locations. But again, these tended to be more specific to 1 or 2 countries. For example, in New Zealand was the only place we heard references to serious games. So further variation, but these are the overarching themes on how results were communicated in ways that people thought were effective. So overall, the formats that were seen as most useful or successful in sharing those results were those that were interactive, that broke down information and technical details into more intuitive formats, and then methods that fostered engagement with the information that was being generated. When we asked decision makers and end users kind of what made scenarios credible, the final component of this second research question, participants kind of overwhelmingly discussed the features of the development team for scenarios and the range of expertise that it invoked, so the credentials of the developers and the kinds of perspectives represented on the team, and also the features of the information that was produced with regard to relevance, plausibility, and the quality of data. And to a lesser extent, we also saw some discussion of the process through which the scenario was developed. Again, that emphasis on engagement and interaction. We did see some evidence of that, but it was most heavily emphasized as a component of credibility, specifically in New Zealand and Nepal. Moving on to research question 3, this question asks about specific policies or practices to improve earthquake safety that were developed or adopted or changed as a result of the scenario, and then as well as capacities that were developed and the degree to which a scenario had influenced or motivated changes compared to other factors and influences. There was a little explicit discussion of new capacities that were developed using that exact language, but there was evidence of new capacities that kind of emerged in some of the responses that we saw that'll come out in the data. And Janice is going to discuss some of the more detailed examples specifically around changes to mitigation policies or practices later in the presentation. But we did get some good data overall on the degree to which scenarios had influenced or motivated change, as well as the kinds of changes that they prompted. Specifically for end users and decision makers, they were asked about policies or practices aimed at improving safety from earthquakes or geologic hazards that had been adopted as a result of the scenario. The most prominent response, the most common theme across all of the locations that we saw was around building codes and ordinances. All 4 sites, people referenced these specific kinds of changes. And there's a quote from a participant, a user in Nepal, that kind of summed this up. This person said, "Scenarios inform where to build our house and where to not build," gives an idea about whether to build our houses and at the place where landslides happened in the past. And also there was the experience in 2015 in the context of, they're referencing here, creating open spaces. They're saying that the scenario creation helped to issue and implement a policy on that. And that decision makers were convinced soon because they had that direct experience with an event, and that was shown by the scenarios too. So we're seeing here that the scenarios were having an impact on building ordinances and practices, and also that the scenarios were taken more seriously as a result of direct experience with a hazard. Other themes that emerged about specific changes in policy and practice that were implemented in response to the scenario had to do with mitigation measures that were introduced. There was a fair amount of discussion about this in California and Ecuador, and to a lesser extent in New Zealand. Several references and themes emerging around formal collaborations, and those look different in different locations, and sometimes in some cases that involved working groups or advisory bodies or cross-jurisdictional planning groups engaging with the scenarios, but again, as a result of the scenario. And another common theme that we saw emerge across all 4 sites was around emergency services and protective actions, kind of strengthening those in response to the information that was being generated. So here we saw that manifest as preparedness measures, response planning, and early warning systems. And then finally, another theme that we did see pretty clearly in the data was uncertainty around this. So it was not that every participant said, yes, absolutely, there are these changes that we can directly attribute to the scenario. And some respondents still felt that the impacts on policies and practices were kind of uncertain. And to some extent, that was based on maybe the time period that had elapsed since the scenario had been generated and the changes had been implemented, or the fact that there really hadn't been a test in the context of an actual disaster to see kind of how far those changes had taken them or what had really happened, or the feeling that changes were occurring, but perhaps not consistently. But this is a theme that I wanted to reference here. It came out specifically in response to this question, most commonly in California and New Zealand, but we did see that same caveat emerge in response to other questions. So moving then to the question that was asked of decision makers about the extent to which scenarios had motivated changes in policies and practices, specifically relative to or in comparison to other contextual factors, we did see some of the same themes emerging. The responses about specific changes that were referenced and how they were contextualized did vary, as you would expect, by location. There were different things that had emerged, changes that emerged in different locations. So policies, but those generally coalesced around things like policies, increases in funding, changes to planning practices or coordination. But again, relative to other factors. So for example, in Ecuador, because of the proximity of neighborhoods to coastal and volcanic areas, many respondents talked about their ongoing work with these neighborhoods, both in the context of the scenario and ongoing after that, to ensure that residents were aware of hazards and how to plan and respond to potential events. But there was some motivation that happened partly in relation to the scenario, but specifically around that awareness and planning piece. But here too, we did see that a subset of the respondents felt that the degree of change that could be attributed to a scenario was potentially limited. So they didn't feel confident commenting on that specific impact of the scenario, even in relation to other factors, or they felt that perhaps it was too early to tell, or just that it may not, perhaps the scenarios hadn't necessarily been that influential, but there was skepticism that was expressed, particularly considering these other potentially intervening factors. Others explained that changes had occurred and were likely linked to scenarios, but the scenarios per se may have been less important than other factors in motivating change. So here we have a quote from a user in Ecuador that kind of summarizes that perspective. This person said that more than the scenario, influence came from the fact that there was an earthquake and that there had been an eruptive process. So thinking that they're, again, pointing to this idea that the scenario had been useful, but really the thing that pushed change forward was actual experience with a disaster. So in these cases, some participants stated that the attention towards the scenario findings or recommendations, maybe aren't always taken seriously by authorities until there's some other kind of intervening factors. Others talked about competing priorities or lack of political will. So again, we see that it's hard to conceptualize the scenario results as having a direct link to changes to policies and practices, but that sometimes it's maybe working in concert with other things that are happening or other experiences on the ground. And finally, with research question 4, this question asks about the influence of credible and detailed earthquake hazard information, and whether there's a threshold of scientific quality for the scenario to be considered credible and effective. And I can say that participants across all of the locations kind of struggled with this notion of distinguishing hazard information from other types of information that were contained in the scenario. So that concept and the specific distinction there is not as well addressed in our data, but we can speak to the aspects of scenarios that were most commonly used and the value or emphasis that was placed on scientific quality. So overall use, when we're looking at the aspects of scenario that were used across all locations, we had participants kind of talking about the broad overall use. So when they're asked about the specific dimensions of the scenario, the decision makers kind of described overall scenario processes that being used to tell a consistent story based on facts, that kind of paints this realistic picture to engage participants and ensure that they gain a greater understanding, or stakeholders that they gain a greater understanding of what might happen, and to promote action in a variety of areas. So sometimes that overall use case was discussed as promoting resilience, enhancing awareness or understanding, or strengthening emergency preparedness and response planning, to some extent planning for secondary hazards. But again, rather than narrowing in on one specific aspect, talking about using the scenarios holistically for these applications. but then narrowing down to the specific segments of or components of the scenario, consistent with some of the findings that the themes that emerged in under other questions presented earlier. Another frequently referenced component included information on the vulnerabilities. We're trying to figure out, what systems need to be strengthened, where the impacts will be greatest. And that was discussed a lot in California and Ecuador. There was also another prominent theme across all locations was the social and economic impact, really focusing in on those aspects of the scenarios to try to understand, again, what's at stake and how the local people and economies will be affected. And then California, New Zealand, and Ecuador, we saw a strong theme emerge around using the scenarios for networking and engagement. So talking to end users. And we have a quote here that kind of illustrates that point. This is a user in New Zealand. And this person is saying that the scenario gave them credibility in a document to increase their validity to talk to people. And that ranged from the smallest community group to the board of directors of big multinational businesses. But again, we see that it provided opportunities to engage stakeholders, to speak from a firm scientific grounding, and to pursue important conversations and collaborations using that as the basis. It also speaks to why it's so important to generate information products as part of the scenario that fosters this kind of engagement activity. And then finally, returning to this question of whether there's a threshold of scientific quality when looking at responses from the developers, we see that yes, there is basic agreement that a scenario needs to be scientifically credible. But even among this group, the specific elements of that credibility or the level of emphasis on scientific quality after a certain point varied. So across all sides, the most prominent theme was, yes, scientific quality is of high importance. And then after that, we see these other sub-themes kind of emerge. So sometimes that how that's being evaluated is in the context of scientific consensus. We saw that most clearly in California and New Zealand respondents emphasizing that point. We also saw an emphasis on accuracy and specificity as an indicator of scientific quality that emerged in New Zealand and Ecuador. But then we also saw these themes emerging around trade-offs and relativity. And those kind of are touching on similar themes, but they're somewhat distinct as well. So in Ecuador and Nepal, we saw this discussion around scientific quality being important, but people framing that importance relative to other factors. So that was similar to and different from trade-offs. And that was this idea that the scenarios or studies' effectiveness and credibility lied within their application, but that sometimes you needed to account for other factors to make sure that application happened. That yes, the scientific quality is important, but we also need to make sure that there's room for this information to be digestible enough to be compelling enough to promote action. So similar kinds of critiques or concerns that were brought into that conversation. In Nepal, relativity was discussed in terms of local knowledge and other forms of expertise. So yes, scientific quality is important, but we also need to be incorporating local knowledge because there are some things that you can't get through scientific analysis with the kinds of data sets we have access to. So again, there was some variation in by stakeholder as well. And that was this idea that some people felt the importance of scientific quality depended on who was using the scenario. And that came out most prominently in California and Ecuador. But again, so overall, in summary, there's this emphasis that yes, scientific quality is important, but then these other caveats that came in that kind of modified that response around other considerations of what was needed to really push the scenario forward towards that impact on mitigation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sue-Ann to start to discuss the Net Promoter Score analysis. That's our quantitative data that was generated. And Sue-Ann, just let me know when you want me to change slides.
Okay, thanks, Dania. You can go on to the next slide. Thank you. So what I want to spend is just a few minutes talking about a score that we generated from the responses of each of the interviewees. As Nanya described in detail, they gave us quite a bit of qualitative information, and thematic content analysis showed that there were similarities and differences among the various sites. But what we also wanted to do was sort of, along with that specific details, we wanted to get sort of this 30,000 foot up view of, just in terms of a numerical score, the experience with the scenarios from the users and developers perspective. And so what we brought in was the idea of a net promoter score. And I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this score. It is often used in research when you're looking at customer experience or customer loyalty. And in essence, you generate a score that looks at the extent to which the person that is using the scenarios would recommend that product or service for future use. And you look at this, we kind of, in the business world, sort of look at this as a measure or a metric of success, just an overall metric of success. And the way you derive the Net Promoter Score is you literally ask folks, you know, how likely in this case are you to recommend the use of scenarios of geological hazard events and mitigation and preparedness planning? And we ask this at the end of each of the interviews. And people are then categorized into three broad categories based on, you have them rate this on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being not likely at all to recommend, to 10 being very likely. And what you see is people fall into three broad categories, which I have sort of color coded here, sort of like a traffic light kind of coding. And it's depicted here, the promoters, the folks in green, are the strong supporters of your particular product or service. So those are the respondents that gave it a 9 or 10. Yes, we would be very likely to recommend the use of scenarios for mitigation and preparedness planning. The passives are the folks that fall just underneath that. They're giving it a 7 or 8. These are the folks that are not your strong supporters. The folks that are in the green and the red tend to have the strongest customer loyalty. Either they're strongly loyal to that product or they're strongly not engaged in that product. Those passives that are in the yellow clearly run in between. And those are the ones that when you're looking at a product or service are most likely to be persuaded either one way or another. And a lot of times they're the folks that you'll target moving forward. And in this case, they get the score of 7 or 8. The detractors are the folks who are not heavily invested. They did not have a good customer experience. And they rate the respondents that give it 6 or less, meaning they are much less likely to recommend that product or service. The Net Promoter Score is then calculated. You take the percentage of promoters and subtract the percentage of detractors. And so what you get is a score that ranges. If everyone is a strong promoter and a strong supporter of the scenarios, you would get a score of 100, because 100% of the people would fall in the 9 to 10, and 0% would fall in the very low 6 or less. So as this depicts, you would get a score of 100. If on the flip side of that, you get very low scores where 100% of the people are rating it 6 or less, you would have 0% of the promoters and 100% of the detractors, and you would end up with a negative 100. And so folks always ask me, well, okay, so where does that mean, 100 clearly is really good and you don't want to be negative 100 because that's clearly you don't have any supporters of the product. And so what we say is, as a general sort of scale, we use this guide that's depicted on this slide, that if you're falling into these green categories, and for well-established products such as that we've seen, particularly in areas where the scenarios have a rich history, what you want to see are scores that are ranging into that highest level, 71 to 100. But you really have a strong product if you're anywhere in that 31 or over category, okay? Where you start to see is you've got a large grouping of passives is when your Net Promoter Score is in that 1 to 30 range, because what that's telling you is you're doing a good job. But remember, those passives are the most easily persuaded. So one negative event or negative feedback can really then limit the use of that particular product or service, in this case, the scenarios. And where you really know you're in trouble is if you're in that 0 to negative 100 range. So what you want to see, again, is the scenarios falling in that green range. So next slide, Nania. What I like to do is when I give scores back, even though I say this is the range, and if you're 31 or better, you're in the green, people are like, okay, what does a score of 50 look like? So we created these visuals. And I like this schema because I've had people give me feedback, oh, this makes so much more sense when we're looking at these numbers, because a number is just a number. But what you'll see is, and these are the overall, this is the developers and the users combined. And what you'll see is very strong net promoter scores, particularly when you're looking at Ecuador, New Zealand, and California. And California, if you remember from Janice's slide, had that was the most robust finding, had the largest sample size. But nonetheless, what you're seeing with these stronger scores is a lot of green. So you're seeing a lot of support and a lot of people that are entrenched in this particular service or product. There is some movement, and you see that there are some that are falling in that yellow range that need to be given attention to. But what you'll see is there are some that are occurring in red for each of the in each of the regions except for New Zealand. So what you'll see is you do want to pay attention to all the issues, and when you think back on some of the issues that Nania brought out in terms of needing improvement, those are the kinds of things that you want to look for in terms of the feedback that they're giving you. I've been asked, okay, these are sort of the overall scores. Was there a difference between the users and the developers? And what I can tell you is I present this and show this with the overall scores because we did see some differences. They trend in the same direction, but not unsurprisingly, the users gave higher scores. Not significantly higher scores, but they did give higher net promoter scores. And you see that across countries. And Nania, if you can flip to the next slide, what you'll see is the developers, they still trend in the right directions, but the scores are slightly lower. This isn't uncommon because the developers have that sort of firsthand knowledge. A lot of times, like I just had this with some training that I was evaluating, where the trainers will give slightly lower scores than the folks receiving the training. And that is because the developers do have more intimate knowledge with what they feel are the strengths of the scenarios and the weaknesses than did the users. But nonetheless, what I wanted to convey was consistent with what we were hearing about qualitatively with our feedback, that there was a positive response to the scenarios. We are also seeing in this numerical rating, but be aware that there is some room for improvement in the yellow and the red that was emerging. And this is consistent quantitatively in the net promoter scores, along with the qualitative information that Nania fed back.
And so that's the interview findings. That's what we have for those. Happy to ask questions about those, but I'm going to hand it over to you, Janice, now to go over the mitigation linkages.
All right. Thanks so much, Nania. I see some questions coming in. Please add more questions in the Q&A, and we'll sort through those and get to them in just a few minutes after I share a few more results. Just share my screen again. Okay. So now I want to go back to this question of that Nania has already started to look a little bit at, and that is, well, did anything happen as a result of scenarios? Did they lead to mitigation? And this was a complementary effort that I was working on, and both looking at this bigger question and then into some of the details of how scenarios contributed, if they were leading to or influencing mitigation. So the answer that what we found is yes, there was a lot of mitigation that could actually be traced back to scenarios, to have a contribution from scenarios. And we'll look at two cases where we have a kind of a scenarios that were substantive and occurred sometime, were developed some time ago, and we can look at the impacts on mitigation in Nepal and in California. So in California, there were a lot of things that were influenced by different scenarios, ranging from work on buildings to infrastructure, local hazard mitigation planning, and what we call household mitigation. That means in my house, I might anchor a bookcase to a wall or make sure my house is anchored to the foundation so it doesn't slide off during an earthquake. That's what we mean by that term. In Nepal, the focus was a lot on schools and on mason training that then would introduce better construction practices in the community. And also we saw in the data information about scenarios influencing building code implementation programs to help improve construction more broadly. So the key areas for California, some soft story building retrofit programs. This is a key area of vulnerable housing in California. Also non-ductile concrete buildings. I think we've all seen the devastating results of what can happen to those buildings in an earthquake from what's happened in Turkey and Syria. And also unreinforced masonry buildings. That's what we mean by URM. I'm sorry, I'm using the structural engineering shorthand here. Those buildings have been recognized all over the world to be dangerous, and as well private schools in California and infrastructure such as water systems and transit systems in particular. And Nepal has mentioned more focus on schools and building code implementation. So I wanted to go through a couple of examples here just to illustrate how scenarios influence mitigation. And I want to take one example is soft story building retrofits in California. And that's these type of buildings where you've got, say, residential up here. These are apartments. And then down below, there are either parking or shops. Anyway, it's open, and in an earthquake, that type of building can lean over, as this picture up in the corner shows, and then possibly collapse. And these efforts, really, we can trace them back to the late 1980s. Also motivated by an earthquake in Northern California, the Loma Prieta earthquake. That was when this damage occurred to this building. At that time, a lot of cities were working on other priorities, such as their unreinforced brick masonry buildings. And I want to highlight here a couple of things. We have on the left, the shocks, things that are happening in the context in terms of disasters and major events. We have scenarios, and we have the mitigation actions, and then we have contextual factors. And this influence diagram looks at what the interrelationships are. And I want to point out a couple of things. One is just the complexity. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of interrelations between scenarios and between contextual factors influencing mitigation. Scenarios often serve as catalysts. And also scenarios you don't always see just the scenario contributing. We much more often see the context coming in as well. And we see a lot of influences working together to get to actual mitigation implementation. And so here are some of the mitigation results, like Nania was mentioning. These happen to be ordinances passed by a city government for mandatory retrofit programs. I want to highlight here this CAPSS, that's the CAPS project in San Francisco, the Community Action Plan for Seismic Safety. That effort, which was led by the Applied Technology Council and working with the city, was a scenario-based mitigation planning effort. So the scenario was used in the context of this mitigation planning effort, and they tackled, in particular, this type of construction. There were a lot of other things that had to happen to get that mandatory retrofit program across the line, including political support. Media reporting contributed to that. There were some what we call champions in local government who really took this issue as something that they wanted to work on. And then once we had some movement in San Francisco and Berkeley, other cities saw that and said, oh, we can work on this too. This is an important issue. We're concerned about housing. We may lose a lot of housing if we lose these buildings. And so all of that going down to down here at the bottom, Plan Bay Area 2050, which is the regional plan for the San Francisco Bay Area, does include a strategy related to retrofitting these buildings. And there have been some exciting other developments as well. But this is scenarios have contributed to this effort, but there have been a lot of other things going on as well. In Nepal, I want to just highlight some work on schools, starting with initial interest sparked by an earthquake in 1988 and concerns about Kathmandu that led to a scenario and action plan that was then taken up by a local nonprofit organization that worked on schools after that. And this timeline ends with the Gorkha earthquake, just to show this pre-disaster mitigation. And you see here, you have some supportive funding, you have government support, you have receptivity from officials, leading to a very large program that then was working on retrofitting more schools. So we see a lot of things happening that scenarios catalyze, or they start the process by getting people to work together on important risk problems, to build relationships and to build consensus around what needs to be done. Another example from water resilience programs in California, this was starting with an internal scenario that was used to develop public and ratepayer support, elected board support for a major seismic improvement program in Northern California. In Southern California, there was the shakeout scenario, one of the largest and most well-known famous earthquake scenarios, was utilized some years later. There's a lot of interesting things that happened to get to the point of the Resilience by Design program, including elected official support, a lot of advocacy, and a partnership between the USGS and the city of Los Angeles, some support from the 100 Resilient Cities program on staffing. And that resilience plan had among its elements items that were really taken from the technical findings of the shakeout scenario. And then the LA Department of Water and Power developed a resilience program and started to make some changes in their system, such as developing a resilient pipe network. And there's a lot that's been written about that work. And there's ongoing mitigation. More recently, the haywired scenario in Northern California is starting to feed into and influence further water system upgrades at multiple agencies. So if we take a look at all of this together, as well as examples from other mitigation programs, we can draw out some common patterns and themes for scenarios in how they influenced and were used to support and motivate mitigation. The first was communication, and Nania talked a lot about this. And that's really contributing to the creation of an environment that's conducive to mitigation. And you need to build that environment before people are willing to, say, take political action on something. Of course, disasters also will contribute to that environment, as we saw in the results from Nepal. And we see that again and again, this pairing up of disaster experience and scenarios. So, and that's this third bullet, that's where we see that most often, where professionals typically would be advocating for a specific mitigation program or policy by presenting the consequences of inaction, or perhaps your champions in local government would be doing that advocacy. So on the one hand, you would have the examples of damage in a real geologic hazard event. This happened, and then a scenario showing, well, if we don't do anything, then this is what can happen here, where we haven't yet had our earthquake, or we haven't had, say, a major volcanic eruptive episode in a long time. So that was something we saw over and over again, was this pairing up of this has happened in past disasters and this can happen here based on our scenario study, and we need to do something about it. Also, as Nania mentioned, there's this idea of using a scenario to look more broadly at the risk problems or the resilience challenges that you might see at a city or a regional scale. So not looking at, say, the vulnerability of a specific building or a specific type of infrastructure, but looking more broadly at the region, what can happen. On the other hand, scenarios are definitely used to look at specific vulnerabilities of, say, a building type, like the soft story buildings, or like a water system. And in the United States, in particular, there is a process through the Federal Emergency Management Agency of developing local hazard mitigation plans, and scenarios are frequently used to set the priorities in those plans. Those are often scenario-based. Another thing that we frequently see is that scenarios and the process to create them catalyze this chain of events that leads to mitigation. But that is not an automatic process. There are complexities, there's interdependencies, there are significant sources of influence, particularly if you need action politically, say to pass legislation or an ordinance requiring a type of action at a municipal level to address certain types of buildings or to implement building codes. If you need action there, you need there needs to be some other ingredients, I suppose. Also, significant dedicated efforts are required. One of our team members, Arietta Checa, says, once the scenario is finished, then the real work begins. And that was really borne out by our data. We really had to do a lot to go from the scenario to mitigation implementation on the ground, which makes sense, right? But that was borne out. I think we saw very rarely did mitigation just result from involving people in the process and them taking things and running with it. There usually needed to be some more active engagement and advocacy. So all this leads to the idea that we need to build in funding and support for pathways to implementation from the beginning, whether that's making sure that the scenario is feeding into a planning process that is also funded and supported, or whether we have other pathways that we are going to be able to implement the results if we really want to see mitigation work. So that concludes the results we want to share with you today. What we're going to do now is take those results and prepare some guidance on how we might improve scenarios going forward, addressing some of the issues that Nania mentioned, also bringing in some of those practice advancements. We're going to continue to work on technical practice advancements, and we're going to try it out with an implementation project. And on that using what we've learned piece, if you are interested in being a part of that conversation of how we can make scenarios better and how we can improve practice in the future, there's a link in the chat. If you could please click on that, and there's a simple, really short Google form, and we're going to be having a series of discussions as a team and with the people in the broader practice about how we can go ahead with making scenarios more effective than they already are. So I'd like to thank the sponsors of this work, the U.S. Agency for International Development and the U.S. Geological Survey, and thank you for your time and attention. And now I'd like to move into the question and answer portion of our webinar. I see a lot of questions in the chat. Please continue to drop those in, and we will select from those and answer them live. All right. So one of the first questions that I have on the list, and this one is for Sue Ann, is why are this is about the Net Promoter Scores. Why are the Net Promoter Scores for Nepal so different? Okay, you're on mute, Sue Ann.
I use Zoom every day. You'd think I wouldn't do that. Sorry about that. That's a really good question. I think part of, like I said, I think when you look at the Net Promoter Scores, the sample size for these is small. So please bear that in mind. Typically, when you see Net Promoter Scores, you're looking at, data from hundreds and hundreds of users. But what we did find was just that, stronger support for from the other regions for the scenarios themselves. Some of that to the issues that when you look at, okay, well, what does a Net Promoter Score mean? One of the things that I want to emphasize with, and I'm so glad you asked this question, is it's just a number. And so it's really all of the issues that Nania and Janice have been talking about. It's that 30,000 foot up. So the real importance of this is the why behind it. So all the elements that we saw for folks that were giving the stronger scores, and that we saw where the scenarios were being recommended more, we heard when we asked, the why behind it, it was that idea of there were certain elements that they felt that were necessary in order to achieve those higher scores, and those thematically kept coming out. So we saw things like where there was more collaboration and engagement, where, to Janice's point, where there was someone who was serving as a champion to move the needle forward, to take that scenario, ensure that its use was being promoted. It was the idea of having that scientific credibility, but also being able to use the scenario to speak to all the relevant stakeholders, because the communication messages are slightly different based on who you're talking to about the scenario. So to that extent, the Nepal scores were, like I said, there's no red flags here. You're not seeing the predominant of folks rating at 6 or less, but there was more room for improvement with respect to those key elements for Nepal. Nania, do you have anything to add to that?
I think you explained it pretty well, Sue-Ann. I think there is also this desire to move the needle forward. And so sometimes there was a reluctance to give a numeric rating for scenarios because there was an emphasis on the need to focus on the action component, less interest, because there was a long history of scenarios at this point, more of a desire to focus on the need to move from scenario to action in terms of policy or mitigation. So that factored in to some extent as well.
And one thing that we heard in Nepal that we didn't hear in the other regions per se, when they were describing the value of the scenario, they were saying there was a need for validation of the scenario. And that was one of the factors that Nania showed in that area for improvement. That was something that was characteristic only to Nepal and not within our respondents from the other regions.
Okay, let's go ahead and go to the next question for Nania. I think this one is, can you comment on the trade-offs on the selection of scenarios, say between a very rare event with high impact versus a much more likely scenario with smaller impact?
Sure, and I'm glad that this question was asked. We saw this returns us to the points that were being made about plausibility, and there was a fair amount of discussion with end users and developers about the trade-offs between developing the high consequence event versus perhaps that was less likely versus perhaps a lower consequence event that was perhaps more likely. And there was an important need to strike a balance between showing everything that could happen and still being believed. In some cases, there was an understanding that if we went with the worst case scenario, it could be kind of demoralizing to end users and also be less credible with them because it was seen as something that was unlikely to happen. So there was a need for consideration about what would be not necessarily palatable, but what would be seen as a plausible event that really warrants planning and response versus just what could happen. And I think to some extent, one of the responses that some participants discussed was presenting a range of scenarios, and also so the idea was to give people away from this idea that the scenario specifically was detailing what would happen under any event, but providing a range of potential, consequences, a range of potential impacts that could occur. Hopefully that answers the question, but certainly there was a discussion around that concept of plausibility and making sure that people could see themselves, right? Decision makers could see themselves in that event and their responsibility for planning in response to that event being a good use of time.
The next question is about equity, about the scenario we're considering an equity lens. Nandy, do you want to take that one as well?
Sure. And this is another one that we've discussed a lot within the interview data analysis team. We saw significantly more discussion of that equity piece and the concept of social vulnerability more broadly in the California sample. There was some reference to some extent in the New Zealand sample, but really the entire discourse on social vulnerability and equity was much stronger in California. So there were people, decision makers, talking about the potential consequences of an event that were modeled or that were proposed by the scenario in terms of the, looking at the impacts in terms of equity on the population. How do we respond to this in a way that's equitable? How do we ensure that we're promoting mitigation in ways that have an equitable impact on the population? And also some discussion of that in the scenario. We saw in the California scenarios, there was an emphasis on when we're looking at the impacts on the population, here are the outcomes in terms of social vulnerability, populations that are disproportionately exposed. But again, it was much stronger in California that we saw in other locations. And we started talking about the extent to which just the concept of social vulnerability might vary from culture to culture in terms of how researchers and decision makers are talking about that. I don't know if there's anything you want to add on that point, Sue-Ann.
Yeah, that's well said. I think, when we were looking at California, they were also, they were addressing some of the very specific vulnerable populations, which, to Nania's point, we weren't seeing that in the other countries, but they were keenly aware, particularly about whatever the community group was focused on within that particular area. They would be citing those vulnerable populations with respect to the response. And so that we saw, as I said, they were just more keenly aware of that within the California interviewees than within the other countries.
Okay, the next question is about Nepal, the Nepal studies, whether they were after the earthquake or not. The body of scenario knowledge that is available in Nepal and the studies that are available really date from about 1997. And we tended to focus on the earlier studies. There were also some major studies, such as one by JICA released in 2002, and then a number of studies prior to the 2015 earthquake. And we wanted to take a look at those in particular, just because there's time for mitigation programs to have happened. There have been some studies after the 2015 earthquake, and but there hasn't been quite enough time to necessarily see all the outworkings of those studies. They're pretty recent. Generally, it takes some time for things to get done in terms of hard mitigation on the ground. So I hope that answers that question. The next question is a technical one about software for landslide scenarios. This research was looking at different things that people used. I don't know, Nani, if there was any specific software that was mentioned for landslide modeling by the interviewees.
I'd have to go back to the interviews to really see. I'm sure in some cases there were references, but there wasn't a lot of detail about specific software or technologies.
Yeah, and I think this is an area of real interest that we saw, that these hazards events that are perhaps cascading or triggered by an earthquake. It's very important to look at those, but how we do that in a manner that's cost effective and still maintains that scientific quality that is so important. Coming out of the interview results, that's a real question for us, and so that's something we'll be looking at during our practice advancements. There's another question about retrofitting of houses taken into consideration. We didn't ask about, did you do this specific mitigation measure? We asked more, it was more open-ended and seeing what the respondents would tell us about the types of mitigation that was coming out. So I don't know, Nania, if you or Sue-Ann, if you want to speak to whether the data in Nepal, whether that was coming out in the data or not, housing retrofits.
It did not feature prominently in the data. Perhaps it was referenced by a couple of interviewees, but not in a way that would be detectable for us to really be able to comment specifically on that topic.
Okay. The next question is, what opportunities do you see for advanced technologies such as web-based interactive modeling tools, visualization technologies, ability to evaluate what-if questions in real time, ability to make the scenario a living model or to evolve over time to change the way we conduct scenario studies and communicate the results? I think this is a fascinating question. So I personally would love to see more tools for better simulation at regional scale, to be able to communicate the impacts to decision makers more clearly. I think having those types of capabilities would be really interesting, especially to go forward to see the impacts of what, if we do this type of mitigation program, or we take this type of action, or these types of things are happening in the environment looking forward. I think that would be very, very interesting to do, and I think could help support better mitigation decision making. Okay, and I think we have a great question. Should scenario believability be included in research question 4 about scientific quality? And this one, I think maybe Nania is best placed to answer.
Sure. You know, interestingly, scenario believability did not come up as often in the context of scientific quality, and perhaps that's because that was from the team of developers who were really responding to that question. However, it did come into play in the context of questions about scientific scenario credibility. And so we can only present the themes that really emerged in the data organically that we observed with people discussing, but decision makers talked about this concept of believability or plausibility more so in the context of credibility of the scenarios. And so I think that that's really how people were understanding it, is what makes a scenario credible? Well, it has to be seen as something that's believable, that's plausible, that seems relevant to the decisions that we need to actually take into consideration. I don't know, Sue-Ann, is there anything else you'd like to add to that?
No, just to echo that, you know, the idea of, you know, presenting the worst case scenario, you know, wasn't what they were recommending, that it was something that would be considered more plausible so that that would be perceived as more relevant to the stakeholders' needs.
Okay. So we got another question on, does GeoHazards International plan to conduct such scenario development actions in other countries? Absolutely. The implementation part of this program, that's what we hope to do, exactly that. Once we, of course, have a little more consensus on how we should, in fact, advance practice. That's something that we're planning to do. And we hope that many other people will continue to use and develop scenarios as well. I think we have one question about have any scenarios described recovery and resilience of communities. And this is an interesting question. I think that there are definitely scenarios where resilience building actions that have been taken are incorporated. And so you'll see coming out of the scenario where maybe there's less damage and impact than there would have been had there not been those actions take place. Some scenarios will follow things out a little bit further than others, although most scenarios for geologic hazard events will be very tightly focused on if such and such event happened today, what might happen, and then they might go out into the recovery period a little bit descriptively or model it a little bit. But we were also primarily looking at mitigation. So we haven't done a detailed study of, well, have people gone out and modeled recovery with scenarios. That wasn't the focus of our research, but there has been some scenarios do take the timeline out into the recovery period, certainly, and look at that a little bit. Nania or Sue-Ann, do you want to add to that?
No, I don't think there's anything that I can add. I think you answered the question well. Thanks.
So I'll just read the question for everyone. Generally, no one other than experts can confirm the credibility and quality of scenarios. The quality of the scenario depends on the quality of the assessment based on geological and topographical investigation. Without enough knowledge, I think there's nothing we can do for establishing any scenario. So I agree with GHI that science-based scenarios are essential. So my question is that, do you think that the current geological and topographical investigation technologies are good enough or not? And if not, what kind of investigation technologies should be developed for the future by developers? So I think maybe, Nania, if you can speak to the credibility piece. I might chime in too, but go ahead.
Okay, sure. I think it's important to recognize that credibility is the stakeholder input on credibility is also important, in addition to that of the scenario developers. And that was really the crux of the issue that was coming up with all the caveats under scientific quality as well when we interviewed the developers, was this acknowledgement that even if something is incredibly scientifically accurate, if stakeholders who are responsible for taking that mitigation and implementing mitigation based on what the scenario is producing, if they don't think that it's plausible that that event will happen, then the mitigation action won't take place. And so part of this issue of credibility is wrapped up in whether the stakeholders who the scenario developers are trying to engage also believe that it's worth responding to the information in the scenario. We had a user in Nepal who summarized this really well, saying that in some places the scenario is driven completely by what we know about the hazard, and in other areas it's driven more about what we're worried about happening. So something that could be potentially an event that we know is highly likely but lower consequence, or something that's not as likely, not very likely, but is an extremely high consequence event. And there's a trade-off between those two. And so particularly with the notion of credibility, if the decision makers on the end don't believe that this is something that is worth their time to invest in and think about, then that investment won't happen. And so I hope that helps to explain on that side, in terms of dealing with non-experts or non-technical folks, why this question is still really important for that population.
Okay. And just to speak to the aspect of whether the current technologies are good enough or not, I think this is a really interesting question. I think one of the challenges that we see, across the contexts where we work is this issue of where you put your investment in terms of the data for the level of detail for the scenario, and whether that's in some of this may be a little bit discipline specific. The engineers want more information about buildings, and their scientists may want more information about the geological conditions, for example. But one aspect also is what happens in a situation where you don't have a lot of data, and how much it might cost to generate that data. So I would say for those contexts, it would be very helpful to have methods that could reliably generate reasonably good information that meets the credibility thresholds that Nania is talking about, without without massive expenditures and that would kind of dwarf what you were trying to do with the scenario and might be pulling money from mitigation. So there are trade-offs, I think, And I think there's probably definitely, and I'm not a geologist, so you're hearing this from a structural engineer. My colleagues in geology may have other responses here, but I think that it is a trade-off. And one thing that would be very valuable would be to be sure that we have methods that work in settings where we'd really like to be devoting more of those resources to mitigation and to reducing the risk. I don't know if that, hopefully that answers the question. So the second question we have here is, what was the experience with using scenarios in vulnerable communities, low income, minority, immigrant communities that without prior planning are likely to be displaced in rebuilding? I don't know, I think Nania, I don't know if you can speak to that one. What out of the interview data?
Sure. There wasn't as much discussion on disseminating the results specifically in more socially vulnerable communities, but we did see something interesting in the data, and that's that whole discussion around social vulnerability and targeting more vulnerable populations was most prominent with the California sample. There was some discussion of those themes within the New Zealand sample, and really far less discussion, very minimal discussion with the Ecuador and Nepal samples. So there seems to be some variation in the concept there and how that's being integrated into the scenario and in the responses, the use of the scenario. So for example, with the California sample, there was a lot of discussion around with the users and decision makers around how do we take these results and use them to ensure that our most at-risk communities, our most vulnerable communities who we know are going to have disproportionate impacts from an event, to bring about more equitable outcomes. That was where we saw the most of that discussion. There was some acknowledgement that there were other communities that were disadvantaged and that would need additional help, that would experience those disproportionate impacts in other locations, and particularly in New Zealand, but it didn't feature as prominently. So we can't speak as directly to the question of what it was like to use those scenarios to engage these communities, because there just wasn't as much discussion around that. It was more about how do we incorporate that knowledge into our mitigation policy. But I think that that's an interesting aspect of the data too, that's worth looking into more, is across locations, how are scenario developers thinking about social vulnerability? And also how are we incorporating insights from different experts in various social sciences to drill down into some of those issues. We didn't get to talk about that as much during the presentation today, but there are some concerns about potentially the need for more social scientists to provide some of those insights and also input on strategies for how we respond to what we're learning from the scenarios. And I don't know, Sue-Ann, is there anything else that you'd like to add to that part of the discussion? We've had a lot of discussion about this question.
No, that covers it well. You covered it well.
Okay, our next question is, I was struck by the response that said experiencing an actual disaster was much more effective in spurring action than a scenario. My question is, after a disaster, is it helpful to have scenarios that have addressed public policies to point to actions that can be taken? I don't know, Nani, if you want to take that one.
Sure, I can speak to that a little bit. I absolutely think so. We did see consistently in some places discussions about the fact that yes, when there was a disaster, it kind of validated what was seen in the scenario or not. There is the other danger on the other side, that perhaps if the scenario was predicting impacts that were not seen, that maybe it would undermine the credibility of the scenario. But there was also discussion of this idea that we observed these impacts, they were in the scenario, the plans and the action plans potentially related to the scenario give us tools to avoid these kinds of impacts in the future. So there was certainly some discussion around the need to strike while the iron was hot, while there was sufficient public concern about these issues, these risks, to be able to catalyze that action around the hazards and to get mitigation going.
Yes. Yeah, I completely agree. We definitely saw that in the mitigation results, as there's this idea of if you are ready with what needs to happen, then there's this window of opportunity. that you can go with, and you can also not only in the area, obviously not only in the area where the disaster happened. We saw in the California study examples of earthquakes happening elsewhere would sort of put the earthquakes were back on the agenda, as opposed to other things that are capturing politicians' attention. So the next question is, apart from seismic retrofit programs for vulnerable buildings and infrastructures, what else can we do to mitigate seismic risk by using scenarios? And this is a great question. One of the intents of scenario development is to work together with the stakeholders in a community to understand what the risk problems and the resilience challenges are. And those may include vulnerable buildings. They may include infrastructure. They may include, communities at risk from volcanic hazards, for example, people in lahar zones, where, all of those types of hazards and resilience challenges can be brought out in a scenario. People recognize what the problems are, and then you can start addressing them. And that's where you need that way to go from the scenario to what you're going to do. And often that's something like a mitigation planning process. So you can address a lot of different things with those types of processes. In our practice at GeoHazards International, we worked in a community in Northeast India with a high landslide risk and very high hazard. And what we were able to do was, out of the scenario process, we learned that there were some regulatory gaps, and we started working on that with site development regulations and with some policy development specifically for landslides. So there's a lot of different things you can do. Scenarios are a very flexible process tool that can both provide insight and help you to communicate what the challenges are to decision makers to help spur action. I don't know if anyone else wanted to add anything, Nini or Sue-Ann. Okay. Right. Okay. So the next question is, assuming we've developed several mitigation plans with a limited budget, if we have to prioritize the plans, do we have a good way to quantify the cost effectiveness of the plans? And what do we usually do for prioritization? And this is a tough one. I think this depends on the community and what the priorities are and what it's feasible to tackle, politically, what you have the resources to do. There are some formal methods related to cost benefit analysis that you can use. But there also has to be this realism of, what do we think we can get accomplished? How does what we know about the risk dovetail with the other significant concerns of the community? And we saw that in our results. I don't know, Nania, do you have other thoughts?
No, I think you've mostly covered it. Yeah.
Okay. All right, let's go on to the next question. We are almost at time. I want to take a couple more questions here. Like you mentioned, this question says, like you mentioned, the use of local knowledge and inclusion of social vulnerability becomes important in the scenarios, and depending on the type of end user, be it government or humanitarian agencies, and also the temporal and spatial scale, the usefulness of the scenario varies. What can you say about that? I think that's just
yeah, there's a lot packed in here, so I'll try to I'll try to address the various components. The one thing that I started thinking about when I first started reading this question about the use of local knowledge and of social vulnerability indicators was a story that came out of the Nepal sample, actually, about the importance of having the scenario development team also work with local folks to contextualize the scenario in terms of what was important locally, because that's what would help with gathering buy-in. And so there was this example given by one of the interviewees who was not from Nepal and was a developer from outside of the country, who talked about a meeting in which they were describing the economic impacts of a potential event. And the local folks that they were having this conversation with at this meeting started talking about the need to gather wood for cremation. And it was just a really important distinction that this person reflected on, that they were concerned about monetizing the impacts of the scenario, whereas local collaborators were thinking about the human toll that it would take in terms of mortality and the need to be more sensitive around those kinds of things. And so understanding what really is going to resonate locally about the information that's being produced is really important for getting that buy-in, and something that really points to the need to incorporate local knowledge and local collaborators to be able to identify what those messages are that are going to make the scenario most important. Also, yes, the things like the temporal scale, the spatial scale, those things need to be dialed in and presented in ways that feel relevant for decision makers. We certainly saw that discussed in from a lot of end users, the idea that this information isn't useful until I see how it can be, how it translates into my area or my jurisdiction. I think that the key takeaway there is the need to bring in that local knowledge piece and that local input piece so that the information that's being produced is actually what's needed to help push forward any kind of mitigation action that could result from the scenario. I hope that makes sense.
Okay, the next question is, how do you think in general that social sciences might play an important role in scenario building, in addition to the more dry, I guess, physical and natural science aspects and techniques? I think that our social sciences have to answer that one.
Sure, I'll kick it off, and then Sue-Ann, feel free to jump in with any additional insights. I think there are a few things. Number one, there is a lot of technical information that tells us about the physical impacts, but not the meaning of that for the population that's at risk, right? And so we really need the input of social scientists to be able to understand what that means on the ground and who would be affected. So both in terms of the impacts for the population and also in terms of planning around those things. For example, in the Ecuador sample, we had a few interviewees talk about the fact that they were using this data, they were making these evacuation plans and talking about the implications for people on the ground. But when they went to that community, they realized that they actually had no clue how people in that community would have to respond, at the barriers to them being able to respond if there was an eruptive event. And so it brought home the need for ground truthing what the assumptions were from technical experts, from the natural and physical scientists, with what the actual community life was, what the assets were that people's livelihoods were oriented around. And that outreach and data collection around those kinds of topics that really drive home why this is important to people and why people should care was dependent on having the input of social scientists. Sue-Ann, go ahead if there's anything else you'd like to add to that.
Yeah, I think it's just, to Nania's point, it's sort of bringing in a different perspective into the process itself. For example, like one of the things when they were talking about looking at impact, and you all had spoken about this in an earlier question, where you're looking at looking at cost benefit analysis and things of that nature. And some of the folks were saying, there's so much emphasis on the loss. There also needs to be more emphasis on the benefits. And I said, oh yeah, well, that's a distinction that we make when we look at behavioral economics, when we're looking at the persuasiveness of messaging, is to really emphasize the benefits and the gains when you're looking at risk along with those losses. And it's just bringing that different perspective into the mix to think about the ideas in a way. Sometimes, to Nania's point, it needs to be a little bit more culturally sensitive in terms of the community needs. And then sometimes I think it's just a different way of looking at some of the social and psychological processes that come so natural to us in the work that we do, but may not, from the other parts of the team that tends to be more of the hard science perspective, may not be as obvious to them. So I think it's really just the idea of having that network of thought.
And one other thing I'd like to add is the potential value of bringing in different types of social sciences into these conversations. Often that's how it was described in the data. Oh, we had a social scientist who did X, but there are a lot of different realms of expertise within the social sciences that require input. I mean, economics is a social science, but it's not the same thing as having a sociologist or a behavioral scientist on the ground looking at potential responses to an event. And so also, having potentially political scientists or other realms of the social sciences bring to bear their expertise on the scenario development and dissemination process can bring about different insights into, whether it's the social impacts or how to best promote the mitigation impact that we want to have. I think also cracking apart that appreciation for the disciplinary diversity within the social sciences is important.
And I would also say not just in the design and implementation, but also when you're looking at evaluating the effectiveness, I think the social scientists and the behavioral scientists bring a very different lens into, how you deem something effective or impactful.
Okay, I know we're a little bit over time, so I'd like to thank everyone. If you need to leave, then please feel free to do that. We really appreciate that, but we will stay on and answer the last couple of questions. So the next question is, if the best available scientific data do not reach the threshold of quality required for credible scenario analysis, should we continue with the analysis, or should we wait until more reliable data are available? Now, I have an opinion on this from our practice, but I don't know if Nadia can speak to this from the research data.
I can speak to it from what the scientists who were interviewed for the project, the developers, said, and that was that they were working with what they had, knowing that it was imperfect, but producing something was better than not having any insight and operating blind. And so that was something we saw in a few different locations, the developers saying that it was important to contextualize what was, what the findings were and the potential limitations, but that it was important to work with the information that was available and find as many workarounds as possible to getting as close to accuracy or scientific quality as possible. Not to say that you should work with data that is not credible at all, but that it's important to still try.
Yes, I would want to second that. I mean, scenarios are a very flexible process and can incorporate a fair amount of uncertainty in data. And what you're really doing is trying to get people to talk about risk problems through some of these processes that you're using. And so that is extremely valuable in itself. Even if your data aren't maybe what you would like them to be, you can at least talk about what the problems are and how you might get started on working on them. I'd like to jump to the question about Taranaki volcano. This is a fascinating one. This is, hi, I live next to Taranaki volcano and was involved as an end user with developing eruption scenarios. I agree with the problem about ensuring scientific credibility of scenarios. We've had a lot of investment in science research on Mount Taranaki, and that has helped. We have no living memory of eruptions of our volcanoes, so the scenarios are critical. I'm interested to know what experiences you heard about for other volcano communities with regards to people refusing to believe the scenarios. We haven't had too much of a problem with it here, but have there been science denial problems with other scenario developers, possibly because of the economic impact the scenarios might have on property values and so forth? So, Nania, if you could take that one.
Sure. And Sue-Ann, jump in if there's anything you think I'm overlooking, but I don't think we saw much in the data in terms of discussion about people not believing the scenarios, particularly in New Zealand. There was a point of discussion around a lot of the developers about trust in science and not necessarily not believing. Of course, there were some issues around belief in the plausibility and how much people needed to pay attention, decision makers needed to pay attention to the findings. There was not as much, though, discussion about outright people thinking it was not possible for the events envisioned by the scenario to happen. The more common response, though, was that there simply wasn't a response. And that is to say that the scenario was out there, the developers were trying to disseminate the findings, and work with decision makers to try to push forward mitigation policy, but that there was simply no action and there was a lack of political will or lack of movement. And in several places, there was discussion about the fact that there needed to be some kind of legal framework or requirement to prompt action, because otherwise it wasn't going to happen.
Okay. And the last question is about scenarios being produced in different languages. I would say we saw communication products in different languages. We also see during the development, working with the stakeholders in the local language. I don't know, Nina, if you want to say something more about this. Was from the literature from the interview results, Nina. I don't know if you want to introduce anything else.
There were some components of the scenario or add-on products that came out of the scenario, and particularly discussed in Nepal, that were translated into local languages, and that was mentioned as a specific point of interest, that it wasn't just that it was produced, even if the scenario was produced in English, that all the products related to it were. The point of emphasis being that they were being translated into the local language so that other information products could be developed, or stories that were framed in local themes or sources of knowledge that would be of interest locally. So it wasn't discussed across all of the sample a whole lot. I do think that that it was more common for there to be products that could be used that use the results or the findings of the scenario to be disseminated with different audiences.
All right.
And also, that was a great question, and it's good to see you here, Caroline.
I believe we have gotten through all of our questions. Looks like it. Okay, well, I'd like to then thank everyone for your time and for staying a little bit over to have this great discussion. So we really appreciate all of you. If you'd like to continue these types of discussions, please click on the link in the chat and let us know if you're interested. We'll be holding a series of those over the coming months as we work on practice advancements. So thank you again, everyone. We really appreciate your time with us today. Take care.